Thank you very much, Pranvira, and thank you, Howard, for everything. As Pranvira said, I first went to China as a reporter in June 1989, which was a rare privilege. I was working for The Independent with a great photographer. We went to Shanghai, where we saw mass demonstrations. We traveled to Nanjing, and we ended up in Beijing about a week or two after the massacre. That was the birth of a fascination. That's happened to many others before. I was then lucky enough to go back to Hong Kong for the Sunday Times as the Asia correspondent, in which, of course, the dominant country was China. And I ended up spending 20 years, unexpectedly, doing just that. So the chance to collaborate with Howard enabled me to do something that I had done successfully in a journalistic context, which is working with someone who really knows the material and the ground and the culture and the language to a far higher degree than I could certainly attain. So I owe a great deal to him for the original Chinese language research. Before I go to that part of it, let me just say why this book and why now. The idea was suggested to me after my book on Hong Kong. Why don't you do a biography of Xi Jinping? The answer at the time, several years ago, was we didn't really know very much. Plus, it wasn't clear what was going to happen. At the time, the man was not necessarily there for life. Great events had not happened. He was still a bit bland. And there didn't seem to me to be the material. But now, of course, things have moved on. We've had his elevation to, in essence, lifetime status. We've had COVID-19, which is an enormous event in the early part of the 21st century that we haven't really got our heads around yet. It's so enormous. And then we've learned a lot more because of the stresses with the United States, the continuous jousting in the seas around China, the upturn in rhetoric, and the open alignment with Russia and to a lesser extent with Iran. So we know a lot more. It's generated a lot more material. There's been a huge amount more commentary in Chinese and among the community of China watchers. So the material really is there now to do things that we couldn't do before. The severe stress with the United States has prompted a stream of well-informed leaks from the military and the intelligence services. And it seems to me that when I looked at Xi Jinping the first time, sitting in the Great Hall of the People, which is now 10 years ago, I thought, here's this guy, we really don't know anything about him. I had barely heard of him until a year or two earlier. And Churchill, I think the famous summary that it is, as Churchill said of Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So we've done our best to untangle that. I think it's been a success, but I'd like to hand over to Howard because he is the expert reader, and to show just how contemporary and relevant this book and this man is. We've just been talking about the Chinese media coverage today of the Iranian attack on Israel, which, on the theme of decoding China, breaking the code, decrypting China, the headlines and the official media in today's China tell us quite a lot. So over to Howard.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, sometimes reading and interpreting sources from China, it is an art in a sense. You have to try to understand certain words and certain phrases, why they use certain phrases where and in what context. The example Michael gave about Iran, here if you read headlines, whether you're left or right, it's about an attack and the potential counterattack and the implications. In China, the first tier of state media or the party controlled media, for sure. Similar headlines, but in a much more positive way of, Iran finally unleashes this, wave of missiles, and, Israel be warned. Headlines like that. And if you read down, it's more about how Iran's got a logical thinking and what the next step could be. So very much from a different perspective when compared to when we read newspaper here. It's more aligned to some of the possibly Arabic language media reports. So that, in a way, shows, because China is a state-controlled media environment, so you understand that's what's allowed. And so that's the nuance, I guess. We also talked about, doing research.
Yes. So one thing that struck me about all Chinese leaders is how little we really know about their formation, their intellectual formation, their social formation, even their spiritual formation. And we all work with the same nuggets of fact, which are often divulged in their own memoirs or in official publications, sometimes in conversation, although unscripted conversations between Chinese leaders and anyone from outside China are extremely rare. Nonetheless, when we started digging into Xi Jinping and looking at his background, there is a lot there. To a certain extent, it's been hiding in plain sight. And even though I was reporting on China for a pretty demanding foreign desk for 20 years, I kept coming across things and thinking, why didn't I know that? Or how did I miss that? And turns out we all saw these things, but we didn't really put them together. So what Howard was able to do was reread, in his case, very deeply and in detail, things that Xi Jinping has himself written and published. For example, about his youth, about his father, Xi Zhongxun, who's an extremely important figure in his life. And I think people would like to hear some of the things you found out from that.
Yeah, sure. But first, there has to be a little bit of caveat when you read autobiography written by a Chinese leader. And first of all, it's not written by him. It's most likely written by a group of, writers commissioned by the government. And every single word, every single comma in that published article is checked and double-checked because I had a uncle who once worked for People's Daily, and he did tell me to have a article published through the printer, you need about 70 years of check before it's allowed to go through. So that's the level of, so in a way, we know the officialdom allowed this thing to come out. And it's very interesting when you first read the various versions of Xi Jinping's autobiography. By comparing them, by putting them together, you can see some of the minor differences and whether, which year he's been where, and whether he did this in one version, maybe they said he did, and the other version may have omitted it. So why they omitted? So all these things are the more sort of what they call deeper reading. And we did discover there's this controversial moment in the 80s. Some official media claim Xi Jinping's made his first visit to the US, but some official media just deny.
So here's the mystery and the enigma. The official Chinese media, a very simple example, they say that Xi Jinping's first visit to the United States was in 1985 as a member of an agricultural delegation to the Midwest, where he stayed with an all-American family, was mightily impressed by advanced American agriculture. It was a feel-good visit. He clearly was with a well-organized group who were given a great welcome by the Americans, made an impression on these officials from rural China at a time when China was struggling to modernize its own agriculture. It was a positive story, so positive, in fact, that the host family have praised him on repeated occasions as a courteous and intelligent and charming young man. And he has himself returned to Muscatine to visit that family, and it's a sign, perhaps, of how far things have come in Sino-US relations that such a visit would be unthinkable today. So that's the official version. And then floating out there is an extraordinary second version. There was a man called Harold Brown, who was the United States Secretary of Defense, and he led some of the first top-level conversations between the US and China after 1979. And at that period, China had reorientated itself away from what you might loosely call a alignment with the Soviet Union in the Cold War to an explicit alignment with the West in places like Afghanistan and so on. So Harold Brown goes to Beijing. He meets the Chinese defense supremo of the time, a man called Geng Biao, who is Xi Jinping's mentor. He employs Xi Jinping as one of his junior private secretaries. Later on, many years later, when Xi Jinping becomes leader, Harold Brown, who was then great in age, writes a column which remains on the internet and is published, saying that Xi Jinping's first visit to America was not in a agricultural delegation in 1985. It was as a member of the retinue of the military supremo Geng Biao in 1980. Moreover, this account, as I say, remains on the RAND Corporation website. He affirms very clearly that Xi Jinping was spotted as a young man on the way up and enjoyed the trust of his seniors, and so on and so forth. So this intrigued me greatly. Why would you erase or rewrite history so that your first visit to the United States was a feel-good agricultural delegation and not, in fact, as part of the military-industrial complex? So we dug, and the Carter Library were very helpful. We managed to pull all the logs of the White House visitors for the visit. We found an extremely interesting cable written by the Secretary of State after his lunch with Geng Biao. We found the delegate list at the White House. There was no sign of Xi Jinping. So, courtesy of various friends in the deep state, we then managed to actually find the visitors' logs for the Pentagon in 1980, which recorded the names of the Chinese delegation who came with Geng Biao. And they were evidently not only given a tour of the Pentagon, but they were treated to a showing of Star Wars. So I'm not sure what that was meant to convey. And Xi Jinping is not there. So I conclude that Harold Brown, who, alas, is no longer with us, must have made a mistake. But that is extraordinary because Harold Brown was a brilliant physicist and scientist with an extremely precise mind. He was trained by I.I. Rabi, one of the fathers of the Manhattan Project, an extremely serious person. And I end up in that chapter by saying it is just another enigma because we don't really know. And if you think about it, that's quite extraordinary. Anyway, that picks up, I think, on the theme of Xi Jinping's lineage and his influential father and how he got that job at a very young age as one of half a dozen private secretaries to the man running Chinese defense. So maybe a little bit about his father.
Yes. So again, his father was back in the early days of the Chinese Revolution in a northwestern remote region called Yan'an, where Mao set up his guerrilla force headquarters. And Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father, used to be the local communist warlord, together with another person called Liu Zhidan. So they run the outfit there. And Mao, being defeated in Jiangxi in central China, fled all the way to northwest. In many ways, was trying to find a safe haven. But somehow, shortly after Mao's arrival, Liu Zhidan was found dead in a battle, and Xi Zhongxun was purged, and the place was taken over. But after the communist victory, Xi Zhongxun, as a young, very capable cadre of the government, was given multiple jobs. Was deputy prime minister, minister of culture, minister of many things. And Xi Jinping, in the early age, actually benefited greatly. He lived in great privilege. Was like one of the princes in Kensington Palace.
Yeah, of course, he then falls greatly when his father is purged. And
Yes.
another of the trails or the strands of the mystery, which Howard alluded to earlier, is that although there is a published autobiography and numerous authorized articles, it's all quite vague. So when you actually try to timeline it and you sit down and say, well, okay, when did he live in the cave? We don't doubt that he did, in fact, live in a cave. He was banished to the countryside. But there's a whole sequence of events as to when he was tormented by the Red Guards, when he was put in detention, when he then flees to his relatives and is allowed to rehabilitate himself. It's very hard to pin down, and I suspect this is for traditional Communist Party discipline reasons. One thing that was interesting to correlate, which is quite amusing, is that you can date it. So at one point, Xi Jinping is in a labor gang digging sewers in a district called Haidian in Beijing. And we know that at the same time, because he dates it, Chairman Mao and the hierarchy of the party were that very day on the reviewing stand at Tiananmen Square celebrating the anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic. So that is one precise date. But after that, it is deliberately vague. And it's, very fascinating for those of us in the journalistic and book writing community who try to find out facts about Chinese leaders. I can only imagine how frustrating it is for governments and intelligence services and militaries who try to do the same.
I have no doubt somewhere in the archives there must be a more accurate version of everything. But normally they don't tell you until many decades later when certain leader is safe to be told to the public. So we did lots of cross-referencing, essentially, as Michael mentioned. There's so many versions, vague, and you're trying to pin down the date and the location and whether this person, and especially things written before Xi Jinping was on the way up to the greatness as the latest leader. Before he was promoted, there were other materials and disappearing fast. That's another thing I have to add here. That's one phenomenon during the research I find. Things are disappearing off Chinese internet, even the officially published ones. And luckily, we do have some kind journalists overseas run websites that try to turn them into PDFs and save them. But if you research into Xi, that's one thing. Xi and his family members, information are becoming scarcer by the day.
Well, I mean, you are forced to rely on unofficial sources if you want to go beyond the blandness. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that if you study the official Chinese media, his actual date of birth is not disclosed. It says that he's a Han Chinese born in 1953. The only reason we conclude that his date of birth is the 15th of June is that his friend Vladimir Putin sends him a birthday telegram every year. So that's the kind of thing. And that brings me to a kind of tricky bit, because as a journalist working for a respectable Fleet Street newspaper, I was meant to find out sensational stories every week to placate the editor. And so we would scour the Chinese internet and magazines and books for racy stories and rumors and scandals. In the 90s, and indeed into the first decade or so of this century, you went to Hong Kong. And there were a band of magazine publishers churning out samizdat magazines and scandalous books and racy stories. Some of it true, a lot of it false, a great deal of it just agreeable fantasy. But it was all raw material, and you had to work with it. You can't pretend it's not there. So it then gets tricky in the age of the internet, because as Howard says, more than half a century ago, some of our colleagues discovered that a man called Lin Biao had fallen from power only by going into the Friendship store in Beijing and noticing that his portrait had been removed from the wall. Today's equivalent is when things vanish from the internet or can't be found, or the search engine erases them. So you've got this delicate game going on between critics of Xi Jinping inside China, people who loathe him outside China, and the regime's only extremely sophisticated and ever-improving methods of governing the discourse that reaches the Chinese internet user. And one thing I think was said to me some years ago by someone quite a few of us in the room may know, a publisher called Baopu in Hong Kong, who has been responsible for producing some of the most intriguing books to come out of the People's Republic. His father was the eminent dissident Bao Tong, the highest-ranking Chinese official in the reform movement, who survived into old age. And when the Great Firewall was erected around the Chinese internet, Baopu explained to me, he said, it's not meant to stop people in China finding things out about the outside world. Because if you're a smart Chinese person, you have a VPN, you can find out about Tibet or Tiananmen Square or anything else. But you will never come upon it by chance. The firewall is there to stop things getting in. It's not there to actively prevent searches going out. And the net effect of the firewall is that it slowly sedates the population, and it slowly blocks bit by bit and day by day information that is disagreeable to the party, so that the strength of patriotism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, chauvinism that has been engendered in China is a very slow, subtle process. It's not like there's a series of screeching rallies and glaring headlines. You have a generation of young people who haven't seen or heard many, many things because it never actually reaches them. Meanwhile, you have TikTok and others, which are, digital fentanyl, that are simply there to keep people amused and entertained and engaged. So it poses the real question, of which I'm more than happy to accept criticism, of using material or recycling gossip or telling stories that have circulated and been read by millions of Chinese people on the internet, but which may not be true. So we had to take a decision on that. My decision was that if Xi Jinping is keen enough to stop everybody reading it, then we ought to know what it is. But it poses issues of authenticity as old as writing about Chinese history at all.
And one of those you probably already know is the Causeway Bay booksellers, the book they try to publish. And it's called Xi Jinping and His Lovers.
Try not to hold your breath.
And Xi Jinping, before he even became General Secretary, already the Chinese Secret Service somehow showed up and disappeared the publisher. And later on, one of the booksellers was released, and he's hiding in Taiwan. And he ran a Causeway Bay bookshop in Taipei. And you went and saw him. But these are the things. Do you include, we sort of made some reference to the book. There are certain things. It's interesting to, we try to verify the characters inside that story. The story, by the way, is available online on a linked PDF file. And if you want to buy the book printout, it's like hundreds of pounds or something of that sort. But I did nip my nose and read through the whole book. Very sordid. From page 1, it's all about Xi Jinping's conquest. But loads of those names were actual people, actual women that existed at the time. And it's plausible that some of them may had a liaison of sort with him, but no one, I highly doubt, can really get independent confirmation on any of them. So these are the type of material we're talking about.
Well, I have to pay tribute to the publisher's lawyers for gritting their teeth at that particular half chapter, which is only half a chapter in a 20-chapter book. And I do say that a great deal of it can be safely dismissed as fiction. But then there are things as we all found out, which are stranger than fiction, which we come on to later on in the book, when Xi Jinping is coming to power. So two very brief examples are the story of his rival and fellow princeling Bo Xilai, whose fall from power came about as a result of a scandal in which his wife was said to have murdered a British businessman by poison in a seedy hotel room in Chongqing. Now, if you'd said that to me as a plot of a novel 10 years beforehand, I would have safely dismissed it as fiction. But it all happened. What we do conclude in the book, which I think is one of the stories which the Daily Mail missed when they serialized it, is that we were able to find out quite a lot more detail about that case. And I, for one, am convinced that Bo Xilai's wife did not murder the British businessman, that she was set up, went through a show trial, was threatened that her husband would be...
Bo was set up.
Yes, and his wife. Essentially, she's in prison for a crime she did not commit.
Oh, yeah.
The other story that is true, because the Chinese media have now reported it, is that perhaps the most powerful man in China for some time was the head of the Politics and Law Commission, Zhou Yongkang, who was in essence the security supremo. He ruled over an internal empire of security services, the police, the judiciary, called on the resources of China's multi-headed intelligence services. He was China's point man in North Korea. He essentially kept the lights on in Pyongyang. When Kim Jong-il presented his son, Kim Jong-un, as the heir in the hereditary succession in North Korea, the only foreign delegate was Zhou Yongkang on that balcony in Pyongyang, clapping and waving. In due course, as the power struggles unfold, he falls from power, at which point the Chinese public is regaled with salacious stories about him having sex with people in underground car parks, pursuing a bevy of mistresses, probably murdering his first wife, running a business empire, and numerous other crimes. It reminded me of nothing so much as Fitzroy MacLean's account of witnessing Stalin's show trials in the 1930s and hearing the prosecution case against the old Bolsheviks, whose crimes then, of course, were revealed to the public as legion. And I think that brings me on to another interesting point about political pedigree, which is what do we know about Xi Jinping? And I think in the book, I would say his political maestro is Stalin.
I do agree. And just before this event, Michael and I were talking about this. I said in one sentence, if I want to summarize China over the past 40 years, is that Mao ran a one-person totalitarian system, just like Stalin's. Deng came in, realized that was not working, so he softened it, turned it into more authoritarian, but with a number of fiefdoms, maybe 8 or 9 fiefdoms, divided the country and ran it that way. And Xi Jinping thought that was not working, so he turned it right back into the first system.
Yeah, I mean, that's why his personality is important. Now, we know that party discipline imposes limits on what any good communist is meant to display about their own character and their own impulses and their own private ideas. Deng Xiaoping, I think, famously said that China does not practice personal diplomacy, which any of the diplomats in the room will know is the case, because no Chinese diplomat will ever offer an original statement in the course of a across-the-table dialogue. So that's why it's important to try and dig out those little bits, just as you would have done about Stalin in the 30s and 40s. You know, we didn't know very much about Stalin's drinking habits or his family or his children. That only came out bit by bit. So when you're dealing with a dictatorship, which operates like an imperial court, it's very important to get these little nuggets. So what does it tell us in the UK? Well, I don't think Xi Jinping likes this country very much. not least because his first wife was the extremely sophisticated and charming daughter of the Chinese ambassador to London. Their marriage was not a success. When it ended and they divorced, she came back and lived in this country and preferred to live in London in the early 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher than back in Beijing, China. We also found out, again, serendipity, out there on the Chinese internet is a recurring story that Xi Jinping was irritated and annoyed that he was doing his junior job in Beijing and his wife was back in London a lot of the time, and she was spending time with somebody at Cambridge who was known only as Dennis. And so the dark name of Dennis has been floating around the Chinese internet for some time. You only have to do the math, as it were, and you can place that man. He's the late Dennis Twitchett, an extremely distinguished academic, who was the professor of Chinese at Cambridge. The dates match, the meetings match. What must have been a mismatch is that Twitchett's first preoccupation was Japan, the Japanese language. He was actually a code breaker, which would not have amused the Ministry of State Security minders. And he had a mordant view of China. He said the best thing the Chinese did was poetry, and he hated the communists. And in fact, he only went to China once, as far as we know. So here's this man who clearly exercised a fascination, and Xi Jinping watching from afar. And then you have this extremely awkward ballet between Xi Jinping and the British government when our leaders here decided that a golden era was in order. And I went to Beijing in 2013 with David Cameron on his press plane, and the Brits were whisked off to dinner, moonlit pavilion, banquets, courses, quite a lot of wine. And I won't repeat the words exactly, but on the way back from the dinner, Cameron asked his ambassador, how did you think that went? And the ambassador's expression could not be, as they say, repeated in a family newspaper. And what was interesting, talking to the people who were there, was the sheer coldness. There was no rapport. Cameron turned on all his considerable charm, repartee and jokes and trying to bridge build and so on. It doesn't work. It never has done with Chinese officials. They're extremely well trained, again, party discipline. Back in the 1980s, when I was researching my Hong Kong book and going through the extremely interesting Foreign Office telegrams and memorandums of conversations over Hong Kong between well-intentioned British officials and their Chinese counterparts, there comes across this continuous theme that there is no personal rapport. There is no warmth across the table. You don't bond in the anteroom. And the Americans, I think, have found the same thing, which is why Joe Biden met Xi Jinping at least 8 times, and he actually has said, we're not friends.
Yeah. Oh, just to add a little bit, during the research, you do find, besides the official sources, you do occasionally have to talk to people inside and to get their reference and things, but of course, we're not disclose any names, and just to get a sense. And on what Michael just mentioned about Britain, there is a persistent, if you talk to people in officialdom, and they have a very Machiavellian and very pragmatic view towards powers around them. And the US is the arch villain for them, and it's the arch rival. Britain is also run, it's open secret. So they will treat Britain and with the same, unless you have the actual power, then we're not really equals. That's the prevailing, I guess, attitude in China.
Well, also the prevailing education given to Xi Jinping's generation and the present generation of young Chinese people. Britain's crimes are in the past. They're 19th century crimes principally, but they're usefully dragged up when it serves the regime. I think I'll wrap just by saying that we haven't spoken enough about the Americans. They really have made an effort. I was told an amusing anecdote that when Xi Jinping bowled up to see Trump at Mar-a-Lago, Trump turned on the show. There was a wonderful display, a dinner, a great effort at conviviality. And obviously Trump was a bit smarter than perhaps some people credit him for, because he was quite well briefed. So he asked Xi Jinping, so how is your lovely family? And how's your daughter? She was at Harvard, wasn't she? Where is she? What's happened to her now? And Xi Jinping paused and said, oh, we missed her too much, so she just had to come back to China. And the Americans sort of wrote that nugget down. But they are searching for nuggets all the time. And they put in, we only get glimpses of it, but what you have in the United States is a kind of whole broad spectrum, State Department, intelligence, academic, business input into thinking about China, formulating views on China, assessing China, that is unrivaled. And the other thing I'll just finish by saying is that, watch the Americans for 30 plus years dealing with China. It's pretty impressive. They have sent good people. They've been very, very responsible. And time and again, even the much criticized visit by Scowcroft to Deng Xiaoping after Tiananmen Square, they've kept their heads and they've kept the balance, and they've managed things very responsibly at times when it would have been very easy to make cheap political capital. And so that's why it's more important than ever to try and get our heads around this guy. So with that, I think we'll hand over.
Yeah, we had enough teasers for you. So just open up to the floor, I guess. Anyone wants to query? Oh, okay, Isabel.
Sorry. Thank you very much. One of the things that, of course, strikes everyone about Xi Jinping is that he's run the longest and largest anti-corruption campaign in PRC history. And to be purging security forces, army, rocket generals at this point suggests two possible options. One, people are plotting, or two, he's paranoid. Do you favor one or other of these interpretations?
I think possibly both. And the reason why I say that is we did compare quite a few number of their official announcements and statements, especially during the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th Party Congress. And you can see the gradual shift of emphasis from economic development into national security. And that is apparent. But people need to think one step further. What is national security for a one-party, one-leader state nowadays? So it's him. He fears for his security. When you control all the military, all the police, every single department of the state being now centralized, reorganized, what are you afraid of? I guess that's the question. I'll leave it there. And I do think paranoia and possibly real plots. But we so far are not privy to any of those independent sources of information.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Xi Jinping's relationship with Putin and Russia. When I was in China a few months ago, I was struck by how critical a lot of academics were about the close friendship between China and Russia. They're allowed to write in Chinese newspapers that it's a bad idea to be so close to Russia, but some Western policymakers say we should try and pull China away from Russia to isolate it. My own guess is, and maybe I'm wrong, that I think China's not going to abandon Russia because it feels so paranoid about the United States. It wants to keep all the friends it's got, and it needs Russia as a strong diplomatic ally with a seat on the UN Security Council. But firstly, do you think there's any chance of pulling China away from Russia, and how do you see the relationship between Xi and Putin?
It's one of those cases where if you are a statesman, it's possible to think several things at the same time, even though they are apparently contradictory. So what do they want? I might surprise you by saying that I think one of the things they don't want most is the detonation of a nuclear weapon in the Ukraine conflict. And I think that is something that seriously preoccupied them at some time. You can read the emphasis placed on nuclear weapons control and treaties and so on, that's a signal. They don't want Putin to lose. What would victory for Ukraine look like? Big question. They don't want a triumph for the West or the democracies. One thing that we do know is fact is that Xi Jinping was taught to hate and fear and suspect Russia as a young man. As we know, he spent most of his teens in the countryside. He didn't have a sophisticated education, but when he went for that first job working for the Defense Supremo, the whole culture inside the Ministry of Defense in China was extremely anti-Soviet. Mao and Deng planned to withstand a nuclear assault from Russia, not from the Americans. It's hard to imagine now, but at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, the Chinese even opened their nuclear facilities to Americans who were able to prowl around and inspect weapon systems. They put in telemetry stations. So there was all of that. Remember, they fought a border war. Remember, there is a treaty from the 19th century which carved off the eastern extremity of the Qing Empire and handed it to Russia. Those are now Mr. Putin's Pacific oblasts. So the most interesting thing I found in all that, because what Xi Jinping and Putin say to each other, who knows? But we found a telegram cable from that White House visit in 1980. Quite fascinating, because Geng Biao, the Chinese Defense Supremo, nobody's heard of him today, but at the time he was a big wheel, rolls up in Washington with this delegation, and they're all kind of hatchet-faced old generals in sort of, Mao-style caps and rumpled khaki jackets. They go to the White House, they have a whole session with Carter and the entire top of the American government. And at the end, the president goes off to play tennis, and Geng Biao is taken down for lunch with the Secretary of State, Edmund Muskie. At the end of lunch, Muskie has heard such interesting stuff that he composes a cable which is sent out to all relevant parts of the US government, in which he says, I have heard over lunch the most detailed account we have yet received from an official Chinese source of the Sino-Soviet split. And he then details the crudely chauvinistic, racially charged and paranoid views which each country held of the other. And Geng Biao tells him that the Russians had wanted China to be an agricultural breadbasket for the socialist bloc. They said, there's no need to industrialize. We'll build all those factories for you. And, Ukraine can provide the machinery and all this sort of thing. And the Americans, I think, compared it to the defunct Morgenthau plan for post-war Germany, which was a plan rightly rejected by Roosevelt and Truman to turn Germany into a harmless agricultural wasteland. And the Chinese don't forget this stuff. Remember, this is not 200 years ago. This is not the Opium Wars. This is something that happened in virtually everybody's lifetime, or the lifetime of their parents. So you don't slough that off. And remember, for the Chinese, the Russians are always there. And for the Russians, the Chinese are always there, and there's an awful lot of them. And they're right down there under your underbelly, and they are across the way from your Pacific port. So this is a relationship that is a friendship of porcupines. It's mutually useful at the moment, but we know that the Chinese are exacting a very high price for the aid they're giving, or the material they're supplying. And we know that there's no real love lost between them. We also know the Russians have been playing very, very hard games, but for example, potentially bringing down the last foreign minister, Qin Gang.
Yeah. And just to add, totally I agree with Michael, it's a marriage of convenience between China and Russia at this moment, but there's another more immediate and practical layer to all this complexity. Xi Jinping, on at least over a dozen official occasions, mentioned in Chinese state published articles, documents, the sentence, give up illusions and prepare to fight, or prepare to struggle. How do we interpret this? What is the illusion? The illusion is China can still go back to the old days, being trading partners and friend with Washington, and go back to the olden days of, and somehow she's come to the conclusion after he did make a few overture to, both Trump and Biden, and hoping to come to some type of compromise. When he realized there's no compromise coming, and at this moment, whether it's Moscow or Tehran or Hamas or anyone, whoever can generate trouble for the US-led world order, you are my friend. That's, I guess, the more immediate, more short-term. But of course, in the long term, China and Russia, like in the olden days, China over the past 2,000 years have been having one threat only. It's the northern hordes, because that's the longest 5,000-mile border, and you can never secure it. And 3 or 4 times, the whole nation's come to almost extinction because of that. So in a sense, in the long term, yes, but in the short term, there is that dilemma, I guess, for Xi Jinping.
Peter.
Oh, sorry.
So some of the limits to the no limits partnership are becoming clearer under pressure of secondary sanctions. China seems to be withdrawing financial support from Russia. What other limits should we be aware of? And are they hedging their bets? Will they cut Russia loose if it's seen to fail in Ukraine?
Well, from what I can detect and read from the Chinese sources, in terms of government policy papers, think tanks, that's another source if you get to read some of them. And in a way, I do think it's, again, pragmatism. They want to, at this moment, stave off the economic crisis. So for going full-blown with US right away, there might be very severe consequences. But of course, they do not want Russia to completely collapse. So that balance job is going on. So you see some Chinese banks that still trade with the US and the outside try to cut back on dealings with Russia. And some of the Russian newspapers are reporting on difficulty even getting paid and for agreements already signed. But at the same time, you do see more drones and even daily military rations show up in the Ukraine front. Completely Chinese military daily rations with the compressed energy bar with drinks and all in Chinese characters. And maybe Russia and China can say this is supplied by third party, maybe. But it's showing up in the Ukraine front. And European Union, UK, our own government said up to 75 to 80% of all the drones now flown by Russia are from the People's Republic.
I'd also just draw your attention to the increasing level of disclosure that Antony Blinken and other senior American officials have been indulging in the last few weeks, which is that the curtain is being pulled back bit by bit on what they know, and their diplomatic language has been hardening from originally not really mentioning it at all, and then saying that they were supplying weapons technology but not weapons, and now it's becoming increasingly explicit, as I say, pulling back the veil that they clearly are tracking material. And then there's the whole dual use stuff, and then there's our friends in North Korea, because if a North Korean consignment is transported across the Russian border, or indeed across China, to reach its destination on the Russian front, this all blurs into the axis of autocracies, as it's now becoming known. Yeah, gentleman and then Peter. Yeah.
Thanks. You've outlined how Xi sort of engineered this one-man total government himself. I wonder if you could say something about the dynamics, the risks to him inside of being responsible for everything, internally and externally. It's sort of vertical of power that Putin dreams of actually achieved. But, the high-risk things that China might do, invasion of Taiwan, or indeed, during COVID, of course, she looked quite quite in trouble. So what would it take for him to trip up in such a way that the system would fail?
All right, this is it's a big question. If we go back to his own, I guess, memoir.
Answers on a postcard to Langley, Virginia, I think.
Yes, but also when he was working in the village, Liangjiahe, when he was leading, he wrote himself. That shows his belief in collective kind of working. He said by being the leader and gather and teach all the farmers how to actually do things, and we organized together and we got things done. And there's one of his famous saying that he once so determined, he was carrying 100 kilo worth of wheat on one shoulder, and because he was so determined to get things done, he did not even change shoulders for about 10 kilometers. He just kept walking. Later on, of course, on Chinese internet, people start to murmur, really? 100 kilos on one shoulder for 10K? You must be really, one of those Superman. But this reflects his character. And when he came into power, okay, from the steps he took, he sacked no less than, I think it was 6 public security ministers. 6, one by one. And one of them was even outed as a traitor, or somebody two-faced. This is in official media. And so you named them, you promoted them. How can they be a traitor? Traitor to whom? To you. So these are the things you read through. So he wanted to organize back into the village days, where somehow this one educated person out of 1,000 uneducated farmer, he was able to lead all of them, according to him, did great things. He wanted to almost, transport the same type of, or transportation, maybe another word, to move the same model to run the whole country. I guess once you look at the things he did, step by step, he abolished the old, more, small turfs, and decentralized Deng Xiaoping's reformed structure, and re-centralized everything into one person. And of course, we're seeing the outcome or the result of this centralization, which is almost total paralysis during COVID, and no one dared to say a second word. And everybody, the moment the great leader said lockdown, everybody locked down, and even people starved to death in some of the apartments in Shanghai and elsewhere. People locked their doors because that was what the leader said, until the local government ran out of money and people started going onto the streets to protest. All of a sudden, this whole thing, finished and wrapped up in great victory. So that's more, I guess, where he's tripping up. But whether his reign will end here, that's a big story.
For what it's worth, I'll just give you 2 quick insights there. We couldn't put all of it in the book, but we did have conversations with some very interesting people in and from China, one of whom is a member of a prominent family who've known the Xi Jinping family for generations. And I said to this person, "What are you hearing?" And they replied, "I'm hearing that he's very isolated, that people who he used to see socially, even 3 or 4 years ago, just can't get past the inner circle now, that he is painting a picture of someone who's retreated from the kind of family networks that he used to get a bit of echo chamber back from." And that's kind of curious because it's also contradictory, because one of the things that came on me during the writing of the book was that, we always thought that, okay, Putin's a gangster. The Kremlin is run like a mafia of the ex-KGB and the businessmen and so on, and they're a bunch of crooks. But China isn't like that. It's much more institutional, it has structures, it has hierarchies, it has strong organs of government and so on. But as you watch the last 10 years, or maybe the last 12 years, you realize it's not like that at all. This is really down to a group of families. It's about the relationships between clans, some of which were forged 40 or 50 years ago, maybe longer. And that's what makes it very, very difficult to analyze and penetrate unless you have an encyclopedic knowledge of the mosaic of loyalties and feuds and so on among these people. And I think, just to wrap Howard's point, why is that important? Because the previous two leaderships of China under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were more collective. There was more of a sense that they listened to people. There was a push and pull at meetings between different factions and parties. And you have this doubly concerning picture now of one, a man who is where he is partly because of aristocratic lineage in the communist hierarchy, and is also increasingly isolated. And so we know very little about the group of people who are around him and who are telling him things on which he may base very grave decisions.
Just a last little bit. Last year, there was one book got all of a sudden pulled off all Chinese bookshelves. It was a history book on the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And it was a reprint. It was not even a new book. So lots of people were wondering, what was happening? Why was this book all of a sudden pulled? The moment I read the title, it says some overzealous and micromanager, and at the end, got hanged, had to hang himself when the empire collapsed. So then, all of a sudden, somebody was taking offense over a book that was written decades ago. So,
We'll take a question here and then at the front.
all right.
Thanks very much. Bearing in mind what you've told us about the leader of China and the institutions around him, and given that the American elections aren't far away, what sort of leader in the States and what sort of functioning institution around him do you think would be best placed to deal and manage?
Well, I did speak to people from both the Trump and Biden administrations. I think it's fair to say that on one level, the Chinese like Trump because he's an agent of chaos. But on the other hand, he's unpredictable. So you can't quite be sure what he would do. In Trump's favor, we did a whole chapter which ended up being about COVID, didn't start out being about COVID, but we looked at it in some detail. And actually, I was, trigger warning for sensitive people here, I'm going to say something nice about Trump. He was actually quite serious. He was in possession of information that, had he used it irresponsibly, could have caused an international crisis. And I think when it came to the big questions, this is a kind of Boris Johnson parallel, I suppose, they would say that he got the big calls right. He didn't call out the Chinese on COVID as much as he could have done because he was persuaded of the consequences. So they know Trump, but they also know Biden. And of course, Xi and Biden came face to face, as we've said at least 8 times. There was a relationship and a depth of knowledge between them, and Biden and his staff made enormous efforts during his vice presidency to assemble knowledge on Xi Jinping, build up a personal rapport. They knew each other. Kamala Harris, by contrast, I think I'm right in saying, has never actually been to China, although her vice president candidate has a long history of engagement with China. I would say that if I was sitting in Beijing, I would probably be tempted by the idea of the agent of chaos, but happier in the long run with the standard US establishment foreign policy consensus, while accepting that it's more hawkish on China than it was. The problem with agents of chaos is you don't know where the chaos is going to end up. And one thing we know about Xi Jinping is he hates chaos.
Yeah, and he's created a few.
Thank you. We've been talking a lot about the politics and the impact over these years. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the impact of the economic component of the relationship between China and the US, the tech companies, given a red flag going up and so on, and what the future relationships and the overdependency of batteries being built, and we can go on a long litmus list. Where do you see the future relationship with China and the US specifically, and the overdependency between the two on their economies?
Can I take that one briefly? Just to say, recommend, in fact, there's a flourishing literature in the last few years chronicling in great detail the American economic engagement with China, and in particular the corporate engagement, which grew so rapidly while many of us were there in the 80s and 90s, and how those decisions were made about investment, jobs, technology transfer, the power of local managers. It's an extraordinarily interesting sequence of, if you like, management studies as to how corporations engage with China, and indeed how Chinese companies went out there. I will hand over to the expert on the Chinese economy, but I will just say that the one-line message in the book is that this is a state-controlled economy. There is no such thing, really, as a private company in this China. And we all need to be aware that even when you see the stock market soaring as it did this week, this is the result of having a government that can pull levers not available to a Western democratic capitalist administration. So just keep in mind that when you are dealing with China, you are dealing with the state.
More than one Chinese leader and more than one Chinese official document sort of committed to the fact, or they at least, that's what they believe. The fundamental number one issue between US and China is Taiwan, because the communist regime defeated the nationalists. They failed to unify the country completely, and the one stumbling block is the US protecting Taiwan. So for them to have full legitimacy over what they claim to be the whole of China, they have to overcome this stumbling block. For them, that's job one. And it's the same from 1949 all the way until now. During the 80s, when you mentioned about Xi Jinping Geng Biao going over to the US, there was a bigger enemy, the Soviet Union. So the two sides decided to have a détente, and they put aside the Taiwan issue in the gray area, what even the US admit is a gray area. So you can interpret whichever way you want, but you don't touch Taiwan and we keep it the status quo. Somehow, Xi Jinping is fearing that the status quo may be changing, or the US may be moving on changing the status quo. Hence, the decoupling or de-risking is not started from the US side. If you actually trace down the reporting and the data, Xi Jinping was the one who, fearing there will be some type of confrontation, he's the one slowly trying to pull Chinese companies away. You know, there may be some superficial trading, fine, you know, export, import, but the core technology ones, de-risking started from Beijing, not the other side. But of course, now the world has realized the dependency. So this is a quite complex a picture, and it's much bigger trends at play.
We haven't actually mentioned Hong Kong, which is my main concern, and I think close to many people in this room. But Hong Kong is, of course, now the laboratory where you see the results of the experiment when China takes control of a territory and begins implementing its own system. So I went to Taiwan for the last election, thinking that there would be a dramatic closure to the book that might come out of events there. And the media were very disappointed because, as it happened, the results were quite amenable to Xi Jinping and may well have helped defuse tensions, because while a prominent oppositionist became president, the Democratic Progressive Party lost its majority in Parliament. And so you have a kind of paralyzed government in Taiwan now that is incapable of doing anything radical. That may be a fortuitous outcome. The one thought I'd leave people with is that there was a curious air of unreality in Taiwan. I mean, Taipei is a wonderful city. As many Chinese friends have said to me, this is the China that could have been. And I think Matt Pottinger, who was the China expert on the National Security Council, says in writings and in his recently published collection of essays on Taiwan, this is the China that might have been, its culture, its diversity, its genius, its language, the agreeable nature of its society. And he says, that is something that the Taiwanese are very proud of, but they kind of take for granted. And you could do the whole last night or two of the election, as I did in Taipei, and not realize that there was a gigantic military apparatus just across the strait. And I think when people, it's a bit like other societies on the brink, when people live with the sort of overwhelming reality that something ghastly might happen the next day, they tune it out. And that's kind of worrying too. Yeah. Last question?
We've got two questions,
sorry,
final questions, one at the
Okay.
sides there.
And one at the front here.
Oh, so that means three then.
Okay, all right.
We'll be brief.
I'd like to ask about a phrase that Xi Jinping used yesterday. He talked about a new era. He was writing a letter of congratulations to Japan's new Prime Minister, Mr. Ishiba, and he said he hoped that they would be able to create a mutually beneficial relationship for the new era. What's the implication of the new era in Xi Jinping's mind?
If you read the Chinese media over the past few days, you get the idea, because Ishiba is purported to be a pro-China politician, which I actually personally disagree, but that's the image somehow he is sold in China. And there is a wide expectation that somehow under Ishiba that Japan and China will go on to a more amicable road. But if you talk to some of the diplomatic circle here, whether it's Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese consular embassies and consulars, you get a sense the Chinese think they're winning some type of, sort of divide and conquer war with the U.S. They think they're by trading, by doing influencing operations, they're getting U.S. allies slowly, softer and moving towards their side. There is that sense. So perhaps I'm thinking Xi Jinping is mentioning New Year. He must have got some information from inside Japan, from his teams, that this Japanese government will be maybe similar to the Labour government here, more open to doing business with China. And I guess that's my interpretation on that one.
Next question.
Congrats on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. My question was sort of going back to the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, sort of in 2012 to 2014. Living in China, there was sort of an optimism, certainly from the Western-focused Chinese or from the expat world, and certainly with the trade missions that you mentioned. There was maybe an optimism of greater sort of integration, greater openness, and that sort of kind of quickly disappeared. I guess the question is, was that misfounded, or is there anything in the administration that changed in that sort of years between 2015, 2016, 2017, as you studied in the administration, that sort of changed course on that sort of optimism?
Well, we'll know the answer when Xi Jinping writes his memoirs. I think it's fair to say there was optimism. There was relief that 2012 was a very turbulent year in China. The events in Chongqing, the fall of Bo Xilai, the evident power struggles that they were unable to conceal. There was a feeling at the time that the establishment candidate had prevailed and that China was set for a course of stability. And that just shows you how little we all knew. And last question, I think.
Last question?
Thank you. Peter Humphrey. I was going to ask a completely different question, but we're running out of time, so I've changed my question while listening to everyone else's, and now for something completely different. First of all, congratulations on an excellent book, well-written book, and congratulations to Howard also on his excellent research. I'm only 40% of the way through the book at the moment. I'm looking forward to reading the remaining 60%. But for me,
40% good.
as a person who was, I think, the first Westerner in the international business community in China to be imprisoned in one of Xi Jinping's prisons, I'm wondering how you interpret the vast number of foreigners who have been arrested and imprisoned in China during these 12 years while he's been in power, which by far exceeds anything we saw any time before that. How do you interpret that? Is it safe for foreigners to visit China anymore under Xi Jinping?
Let me give that to Howard briefly, and then I'll come to you.
Briefly, depends on what you do. I guess that's my simplest answer. And if you do and say things the government like, and you bring in money, and they will still roll up the red carpet for you. But if you start to poke your nose into the wrong places, and if they think, or you step on the toes of some local chieftain who's got business interest that disagrees with you, then you'll still be in trouble. So it depends on what you do.
I think some of us in this room had close encounters with the Chinese security apparatus over the years working as journalists. I was detained twice. On one occasion, extremely resourceful colleague and her translator talked us out of the police station. On the second occasion, my Chinese researcher and I clambered out of the kitchen window of a hotel at 5 o'clock in the morning and walked several miles until we hailed a taxi and caught a bus and then got a boat. The result, essentially, is you really do not want to be detained by the Chinese authorities under any circumstances. What is true is that 20 years ago, you could still do astonishing things in China as a reporter and get away with them. I went down the Yangtze 3 times over 10 years watching the Three Gorges Dam being built. We went to the frozen river along the frontier with North Korea and saw people, refugees, coming across. I went to Kashgar 3 times. You could go around Xinjiang, you could interview people. We even went up to the old town known as Gulya, where there was a massacre deep in the past. You could do all this stuff. You can't do it anymore. Technology has changed, monitoring has changed, the political culture has changed, and that is the result of a very determined group of people led by this one man. So I think on that note, I will leave all of this free to drink and discuss. I think it matters everything. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.